The temperature outside read 29 degrees below zero. A cold so savage it doesn't just sting, it invades. It crawls through every layer of clothing, seizes your lungs with every breath, and begins shutting your body down one system at a time. A cold that doesn't forgive mistakes. A cold that doesn't care how old you are, how long you've lived somewhere, or how much you've sacrificed to be there. And it was into exactly this kind of cold that the state of Colorado, a corrupt land deal, and a judge who never looked her in the eye sent Dorothea Vance. 71 years old, retired, widowed, and suddenly homeless, stumbling into the worst blizzard the Rocky Mountain foothills had seen in 4 decades. She had her dog, Biscuit. She had a backpack. And somewhere out in those white, howling hills, she had a memory, a geological memory, the kind that only comes from spending an entire career underground, of an abandoned copper mine she'd surveyed 30 years ago. What she found inside that mine wasn't just 4 walls and a ceiling. It was something alive, something that had been waiting quietly and impossibly through more than a century of silence. And what it gave her in return for one desperate, freezing night would change not only her life, but the future of an entire mountain community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. December 11th, 2021, Greystone, Colorado. The morning had started like any other winter morning at the Vance property. The smell of pine resin drifting in through the gaps of the old wooden window frames. Biscuit padding across the floorboards with his nails clicking a familiar rhythm. The wood stove already crackling because Dorothea had been up since 5. She was always up at 5. Franklin used to tease her about it, back when teasing was still something they did together. Back when there was a they. Franklin Vance had passed away 4 years earlier, quietly and without drama, the way he had lived most of his life. He'd been a structural engineer, a calm and methodical man who balanced out Dorothea's restless energy perfectly. They had built their home together on 12 acres of Colorado foothills land, not just figuratively, but literally. Franklin had drawn the blueprints, and Dot, as everyone called her, had helped pour the foundation during a warm September 38 years ago. She was 33 then, freshly hired by the Colorado School of Mines, her entire career stretching out in front of her like an uncharted seam of or waiting to be discovered. Now she was 71, retired for 6 years, and the home she and Franklin had built with their own hands was apparently no longer hers. The knock at the door came at 9:15 a.m. 2 men, one carrying a briefcase, the other standing slightly behind him as though bracing for impact. The man with the briefcase introduced himself as Stephen Mercer, representing Halcyon Ridge Developments. He had the practiced smile of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had long since stopped feeling bad about it. "Mrs. Vance," he said, producing a folded document from inside his jacket. "I'm here to inform you that pursuant to the ruling issued on November 28th by Judge Colton of the Larimer County District Court, the title to this property has been transferred to Halcyon Ridge Developments. You are required to vacate the premises by 6 p.m. today." Dorothea took the document. She didn't open it. She'd already read its contents. Or rather, she'd already read the 17 documents, counterfilings, affidavits, and property records she'd spent the last 4 months drowning in. She knew every line of every page. She knew the original land, grant dated 1954. She knew the subsequent deed transfers that clearly established her ownership. She also knew that Halcyon Ridge had found a single ambiguous easement clause buried in a 1961 municipal infrastructure filing, a clause so obscure that even her own attorney had missed it on the first pass and had used it as the legal fulcrum to pry her off land her family had owned for nearly 7 decades. "You know this is wrong," Dot said. Her voice was steady. She'd spent 45 years working in mines, speaking calmly in dark, unstable places where panic could kill you. Steadiness was a skill she had mastered long ago. You found a technicality in a 60-year-old document that nobody ever intended to be used this way. The easement was for a drainage channel that was never even built. You're using a ghost clause to steal a widow's home. Stephen Mercer maintained his professional composure, but something shifted behind his eyes. a flicker of something uncomfortable. "The court has ruled, Mrs. Vance." "I'm sorry." "No, you're not," she replied quietly. "But someday you might be." He left without another word, the second man trailing behind him. I stood on her porch and watched his car disappear down the gravel drive. Then she turned around and went back inside to face what had to be done. The weather that morning had already been threatening. A storm system had been building over the Rockies for 3 days, and the forecast was dire. A full blizzard moving in by afternoon, temperatures dropping to dangerous lows overnight, wind speeds that would make travel nearly impossible by evening. The National Weather Service had issued a rare extreme cold warning for the entire region. Wind chills of -40. Snowfall accumulation of 2 to 3 feet. The kind of storm that killed livestock, stalled engines, and stranded travelers. And Dorothea Vance, by court order, had until 6 p.m. to be out of her home and standing in it. She called her attorney first. He was apologetic, helpless, and honest. There were no more legal options available at this stage, no emergency injunctions that could be filed in time, no judge would hear an appeal before the deadline. She called the county sheriff's office and explained that the temperature made the eviction a safety emergency. The deputy she spoke to sounded genuinely sympathetic, but told her there was nothing he could do. A court order was a court order. She called her daughter in Denver. The call went to voicemail. Dorothea sat down at the kitchen table and looked around the room. 38 years of a life lived fully and without apology. The geological survey maps she and Franklin had framed and hung on the walls like artwork. The shelf of field notebooks spanning her entire career, each one filled with her handwriting in pencil, the way she'd always preferred. The worn armchair by the window where she read every evening, Biscuit stretched across her feet like a living blanket. Biscuit, sensing something was wrong in the specific way that dogs always do, came and sat directly in front of her, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one brown, fixed on her face with an intensity that always reminded her of a colleague waiting for a briefing. "Well," she said to him, "we're not staying here to be escorted out by a deputy. That I know for certain." She stood up and began to pack. Dorothea packed the way she had always packed for field work, methodically, without sentiment, prioritizing function over comfort. There was no room for hesitation and no time for grief. She had learned that lesson underground, in the deep dark of mine shafts, where the only thing standing between a geologist and catastrophe was preparation and a clear head. She applied that same discipline now, moving through her home with calm, deliberate purpose, even as her heart was quietly breaking with every room she passed through. She layered her clothing first. Thermal base layers, top and bottom. Wool hiking pants over that. A heavyweight fleece pullover. Her old down jacket, the one she'd bought in 1998 for a winter survey assignment in Wyoming, rated to -30 and still in remarkable condition. Over that, a wind-resistant outer shell. 2 pairs of wool socks. Her insulated hiking boots, waterproofed just last season. A wool beanie pulled low over her ears. A fleece balaclava she could pull up over her nose and mouth, and her heaviest pair of insulated gloves with liner gloves underneath. Into her backpack went the essentials. A compact sleeping bag rated for extreme cold temperatures. Waterproof matches in a sealed metal container. A small folding knife and a short-handled camp hatchet. A headlamp with 2 sets of spare batteries. A first aid kit. Her emergency whistle. 4 high-calorie protein bars and 2 packs of trail mix. A stainless steel water bottle. And, tucked carefully in the top compartment, her most recent field notebook, not out of sentimentality, but because it contained surveying notes and rough hand-drawn maps of the terrain surrounding the Vance property that she'd compiled over decades of hiking the area. Knowledge she might need. For Biscuit, she packed his insulated dog coat, a heavy-duty garment she'd bought 2 winters ago after he'd started showing sensitivity to the cold. His collapsible food bowl, 2 days' worth of kibble in a Ziploc bag, and a small fleece blanket that smelled like home. She helped him into the coat, buckled it across his chest, and patted him twice on the side. He stood patiently and looked up at her with those mismatched eyes. At 5:15 p.m., with the daylight already failing and the first serious gusts of wind beginning to push against the windows, Dorothea shouldered her backpack, clipped Biscuit's leash to his harness, and walked out of her home for what she believed might be the last time. She did not look back. Looking back, she knew, was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The cold hit her like a physical wall the moment she stepped off the porch. Even through all her layers, even with the balaclava pulled up over her nose, the air found ways in. It pressed against her eyes, the only exposed skin she had, and made them water immediately, the tears turning cold on her cheeks within seconds. Biscuit pressed close against her left leg as they moved down the porch steps and turned away from the driveway, away from the road, and toward the hills rising behind the property. She had a destination in mind. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't even particularly close. But it was the best option she had, and in 38 years of geological fieldwork, Dorothea Vance had learned that a calculated risk taken with solid information was almost always better than paralysis. The Copperbell Mine. She had knowledge, and knowledge, she had told her students for decades, was the most portable survival tool in existence. The snow began falling in earnest 20 minutes into their walk. Not the gentle, picturesque snowfall of Christmas cards, but a driving, horizontal assault of ice crystals pushed by wind that had no intention of letting up. Visibility dropped to 30 feet, then 20. The trail she was following, a fire access path she knew well in summer, had already been erased beneath 8 inches of fresh accumulation. She navigated by memory and by reading the landscape beneath the snow. The slight depression where the path ran, the angle of the hillside, the dark shapes of specific rock outcroppings she recognized, even half-buried. Biscuit stayed pressed against her leg, his head down against the wind. She checked him every 15 minutes, wiping ice crystals from around his muzzle, checking his paws for balling snow. He never complained. He never hesitated. He simply kept moving because she kept moving, and that, she thought, was as pure a form of loyalty as anything she had ever witnessed. The temperature continued to drop as the last light drained from the sky. -15, then -20. The wind made it feel like something far worse. Dorothea's world narrowed down to the next step, then the one after that. Her geological training had given her an intimate understanding of cold weather physiology. She had taught a module on environmental hazards to field geology students for 12 years. She recognized the early signs of hypothermia in herself with clinical detachment, the shivering that had begun in her core, the slight heaviness creeping into her legs, the way her thoughts were starting to require more effort than usual, as though she were pushing them uphill. Stage 1. Still manageable, but the window wouldn't stay open indefinitely. She had to find the mine. Then Biscuit stopped walking. He stood rigid in the snow, his nose lifted into the wind, ears forward. He took 3 steps to the right, off the line she'd been following, and looked back at her over his shoulder with an expression she recognized. The same look he gave her when he'd found something on their hikes that he thought she ought to know about. She followed him. They pushed through a dense stand of snow-laden spruce trees, branches dumping cascades of powder on them as they passed. Her headlamp cut a narrow beam through the blizzard, illuminating nothing but white in every direction. And then the hillside materialized out of the darkness directly ahead, a dark wall of rock and frozen earth rising sharply, and at its base, almost buried in a drift but unmistakably there, the squared timber frame of the Copperbell Mine's ventilation entrance. Dorothea Vance dropped to her knees in the snow and pressed both gloved hands flat against the frozen timber, not because she needed to confirm it was real, but because for a long, shaking moment, she simply needed to hold on to something solid. They had made it. The ventilation entrance was smaller than she remembered. Time had a way of doing that, shrinking the things you carried in memory, smoothing their edges, adjusting their proportions until the reality of standing in front of them again felt slightly disorienting. The opening was roughly 2 feet wide and perhaps 3 feet tall, framed by heavy timber crossbeams that had darkened and hardened over decades of exposure, but were, remarkably, still structurally sound. A testament, Dorothea thought distantly, to the quality of the lumber that 19th century miners had used. They built things to last because their lives depended on it. Snow had drifted heavily against the lower half of the opening, packing it solid. Dorothea dropped her backpack into the snow beside her and began digging with both gloved hands, scooping and pushing the packed drift away from the entrance. Her fingers were already clumsy inside their gloves, the cold having eaten through even her insulated layers, and the work was slow and exhausting. Biscuit joined her without prompting, pawing at the snow with focused urgency, his instincts apparently entirely aligned with the situation. Together, they cleared the entrance in roughly 12 minutes. 12 minutes that felt considerably longer with the wind driving ice crystals against every exposed surface and the temperature still falling. She shone her headlamp into the opening. The tunnel beyond was dark and low-ceilinged, disappearing into blackness after the first 10 feet. The air that drifted out was cold, but utterly still. No wind, no movement, just the deep mineral stillness of enclosed rock that she had spent her entire career breathing. To most people, it would have felt oppressive. To Dorothea Vance, it felt like stepping into a library. Familiar, orderly, safe in its own specific way. Inside, Biscuit, go on. He hesitated for exactly 1 second, long enough to look at her, confirm she was serious, and decide he trusted her, then crawled through the opening. Dorothea followed, dragging her backpack in after her, pulling her boots clear of the entrance, and immediately feeling the difference that a single foot of rock and earth above her head could make. The wind was gone, not reduced, not muffled, gone entirely, cut off as completely as if someone had closed the door. The contrast was so absolute and so immediate that she lay still on the cold tunnel floor for a long moment, simply breathing, letting her nervous system register the information that the assault had stopped. Biscuit was already pressed against her side, his warm bulk radiating heat through her outer shell. She could feel her shivering intensify for a moment, a paradoxical response she recognized from her environmental hazards lectures, the body ramping up its heat generation now that it had a chance of retaining some of what it produced. She forced herself upright and swept the headlamp beam around the tunnel interior. The ventilation shaft ran about 15 feet before opening into a larger chamber. The secondary staging area she half remembered from her 1991 survey. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, Biscuit following, until the ceiling rose enough for her to stand in a low crouch and then, a few feet further, to stand nearly fully upright. The chamber was larger than she had dared hope. Roughly oval, perhaps 18 feet across at its widest point and 8 feet tall at the center. The walls were raw rock, dark gray granite streaked with the greenish oxidation of old copper deposits, faintly luminous in the headlamp beam, like the inside of a geode. The floor was hard-packed earth and gravel, dry and level. The air was cold. She estimated somewhere between -5 and -10, warmer than outside by at least 20 degrees, and absolutely still. Dorothea stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, reading the space the way she read every underground space, cataloging its properties and possibilities. The rock walls provided natural insulation. The low ceiling would trap their shared body heat. The tunnel entrance behind them could be partially sealed to reduce cold air infiltration. The floor was dry, which meant no moisture to conduct heat away from their bodies. The mine was structurally sound. She could tell from the formation of the ceiling and the undisturbed state of the walls. No recent fracturing, no evidence of water intrusion or settlement. The copper bell had been cut into solid granite, the best possible rock type for long-term stability. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't warm, but it was survivable, and right now survivable was everything. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothea began unpacking with the systematic efficiency of someone who had set up field camps in difficult conditions more times than she could count. First priority, insulation from the ground. She unrolled her sleeping bag and spread it flat on the driest section of the chamber floor, creating a barrier between their bodies and the cold earth that would otherwise drain their heat steadily and silently throughout the night. Second priority, sealing the entrance. She returned to the ventilation tunnel and used loose rocks from the chamber floor to build a partial wall across the tunnel mouth, stacking them carefully, leaving a gap near the top for air circulation. Carbon dioxide buildup in an enclosed mine space was a real danger. She had taught that lesson too, and she had no intention of surviving the cold only to be felled by her own breath. She filled the gaps between the rocks with gravel and debris from the tunnel floor until the barrier was reasonably solid, then checked the airflow with a damp fingertip. A faint, steady movement of air from the gap at the top. Sufficient. Third priority, water. She packed snow into her steel bottle from the drift still clinging to the tunnel entrance before she sealed it, tucking the bottle inside her jacket against her body. Slow, inefficient, but it would give them something to drink by morning. Fourth priority, food. She forced herself to eat 2 protein bars and fed Biscuit a generous portion of his kibble. Calories were fuel. Fuel generated heat. The logic was simple and non-negotiable. She sat down on a sleeping bag, drew Biscuit close against her side, and pulled her jacket around both of them as best she could. His warmth was immediate and significant. His body temperature, she explained to him quietly, ran naturally between 101 and 102 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to her 98.6. He was, biologically speaking, a better heat source than she was. "You're the furnace tonight," she told him. "I'm the engineer." He shifted against her, exhaled a long breath that clouded in the cold air, and rested his chin on her knee. And that was when she heard it. Not wind. Not the structural settling of old rock. Something else entirely. A sound so faint and so unexpected in that sealed, ancient darkness that for a moment she genuinely doubted her own senses. Something in the mine was breathing. Dorothea did not move. She sat perfectly still on the sleeping bag with Biscuit pressed against her side and her headlamp aimed at the far end of the chamber, where the darkness deepened into the main shaft of the Copperbell mine. The beam reached perhaps 20 feet before the black swallowed it completely. Whatever was beyond that point was invisible, and the sound, that soft, rhythmic, unmistakable sound of something alive drawing breath in the dark, was coming from somewhere within it. Biscuit had heard it too. She could tell by the way his body had changed against hers, the subtle shift from relaxed warmth to focused alertness, his ears rotating forward, his nose working steadily. But he wasn't growling. He wasn't pressing backward against her in fear. He was simply listening, calm and attentive, the way he always was when he encountered something new on their hikes and was waiting for more information before deciding how to feel about it. Dorothea trusted that. She had learned over 9 years of hiking with Biscuit that his threat assessments were remarkably reliable. If he wasn't alarmed, the situation probably didn't warrant alarm. She rose slowly from the sleeping bag, keeping her movements quiet and deliberate, and picked up her headlamp from where she'd set on the ground. She adjusted the beam to its widest, lowest intensity setting, enough to see by without startling whatever was ahead, and began moving carefully toward the main shaft entrance. The opening to the main shaft was a rough-cut archway about 5 feet tall, framed with the same heavy timber as the ventilation entrance. Beyond it, the tunnel stretched away into the mountain at a slight downward angle, the walls narrowing to perhaps 4 feet across. She swept the headlamp beam slowly along the floor of the tunnel, looking for tracks, for movement, for any indication of what she was dealing with. She found it about 30 feet in, tucked into a natural alcove on the left side of the tunnel, half hidden behind a collapsed timber support that had fallen at an angle against the wall, was a bear. Not a large bear, a young black bear. She estimated 2 to 3 years old, perhaps 180 pounds, curled into the compact, economical shape of an animal in deep hibernation. Its dark fur rose and fell with the slow, measured breathing she had heard from the chamber. Its eyes were closed. Its body was completely relaxed, folded in on itself with the profound stillness of a creature whose metabolism had dropped to its winter minimum. Dorothea stood in the tunnel and looked at the sleeping bear for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she began to laugh. It started as a low exhale of relief and graduated into something fuller, a genuine, helpless laugh that she pressed her gloved hand over her mouth to muffle. After everything, the eviction, the storm, the crawl through the ventilation shaft, the desperate night ahead of her, the terrifying unknown sound in the darkness had turned out to be a hibernating bear who had, with considerably better judgment than any human involved in today's events, decided to find a warm, enclosed space and wait out the winter. She retreated carefully to the chamber, checked that the alcove was far enough from their sleeping area to make an accidental disturbance unlikely, and returned to the sleeping bag where Biscuit was waiting with an expression that suggested he had already known what she would find and was mildly amused by her reaction. "A bear," she told him. "We're sharing a mine with a hibernating bear." He thumped his tail once against the sleeping bag, apparently unbothered. Dorothea settled back against the chamber wall, pulled Biscuit close, and let her heartbeat gradually return to normal. The adrenaline of the discovery faded, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been evicted from her home, walked 2 miles through a blizzard, and set up a survival camp inside an abandoned mine, all in the span of roughly 4 hours. She was tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. She was tired in her soul. She reached into her backpack for her field notebook, more for the comfort of the familiar object than any practical purpose, and as she pulled it out, her hand brushed against something on the chamber floor beside the sleeping bag, something she hadn't noticed in her initial sweep of the space. She aimed the headlamp downward. It was a leather satchel. Old. Genuinely old. Not vintage store old, but museum piece old. The leather so dried and darkened by time that it had taken on the color and texture of the rock wall beside it. It was partially buried under a layer of fine silt and debris that had accumulated over what appeared to be many decades. The strap had cracked and separated in 2 places. The brass buckle on the front flap was green with oxidation, but intact. Dorothea set her field notebook aside. She reached out and lifted the satchel carefully, the way she had been trained to handle fragile materials in the field, supporting it from underneath, avoiding pressure on the weakest points, moving slowly. It was lighter than she expected, which meant either it was empty or its contents had dried and compressed over time. She set it on her lap and examined the flap. Beneath the oxidized buckle, barely visible in the faint impression of the leather, were 2 initials. C.A. Dorothea's breath caught. She worked the buckle open with slow, careful fingers, the metal stiff but functional after what appeared to be a very long rest. She folded the flap back and looked inside. The satchel contained 3 items. The first was a rolled length of paper, tied with twine that crumbled at her touch, which when carefully unrolled revealed itself to be a hand-drawn geological survey map of extraordinary detail. Tunnels, shaft depths, rock strata, mineral vein locations, all annotated in precise, confident handwriting. The second was a small glass bottle, sealed with a wax stopper, containing what appeared to be rock core samples. Thin cylinders of drilled stone, each no longer than a finger, wrapped individually in cloth. The third was a journal, slim and cloth-bound. Its cover dark with age, but its pages, when she opened it with trembling hands, surprisingly legible. The first page read, in the same precise handwriting as the map, "Field Journal of Cordelia Ashworth, Mining Surveyor. Copperbell Mine, Greystone, Colorado. October 1893 to March 1894. Dorothea sat with the journal open on her lap and did not move for a long time. Cordelia Ashworth, Mining Surveyor, 1893. The title alone was extraordinary. Female mining surveyors in the 1890s were not merely rare. They were, by most accounts of the era, essentially non-existent. The mining industry of the late 19th century was one of the most aggressively male-dominated professions in America. Women were considered bad luck underground, a superstition so entrenched that it had the practical force of law in most operations. For a woman not only to have entered that world, but to have held a professional surveying role, to have produced the kind of detailed, technically sophisticated map currently unrolled across Dorothea's knee, spoke to a level of skill and determination that must have been extraordinary even by the standards of any era. She turned the pages carefully, her headlamp angled to illuminate the text without causing further deterioration of the fragile paper. Cordelia's handwriting was small and precise. The letters formed with the disciplined consistency of someone who had been trained to record information accurately under difficult conditions. The early entries were largely technical: survey measurements, rock composition notes, tunnel extension recommendations, drainage assessments. The language was professional and confident, the observations sharp. But as the journal progressed into the winter months of 1893, a different voice began to emerge between the technical entries. A personal one. November 14th, 1893. The foreman, Mr. Briggs, refused again today to include my name on the official survey report submitted to the owners. He will submit the work as his own, as he has done with the previous two reports. I have kept copies of everything. I always keep copies. Dorothea read that entry twice. December 2nd, 1893. A storm has closed the main road into Greystone for the third consecutive week. I am effectively living in the mine office, which is preferable to the boarding house in any case. I have been using the secondary chamber off the ventilation shaft as a workspace during the coldest hours. It maintains a more stable temperature than the office, and the silence helps me think. Dorothea looked up from the journal and around the chamber. The secondary chamber off the ventilation shaft. She was sitting in the exact space where Cordelia Ashworth had worked through the winter of 1893, more than 128 years ago. She pressed on, reading faster now. January 9th, 1894. I have discovered something in the lower eastern tunnel that changes everything I understood about this deposit. The primary copper vein that Briggs has been chasing northward is not the significant find. There is a secondary formation running perpendicular, beginning at approximately the 200-foot depth marker, that contains an associated mineral deposit I have not previously encountered in this region. I need more time to characterize it properly. I have taken core samples and stored them here where Briggs cannot access them. Dorothea looked at the glass bottle of core samples sitting on the sleeping bag beside her. 128 years old, stored in this chamber by a woman who had understood their significance and hidden them deliberately from a man who would have taken credit for her discovery. She was still processing this when the mind spoke. It began as a sound she recognized instantly from 38 years of working underground, a low, resonant groan that traveled through the rock itself rather than through the air, felt as much as heard, a vibration that moved up through the chamber floor and into her bones. Biscuit was on his feet before she was, his body stiff, his ears flat. Dorothea was already moving. She swept the headlamp beam across the ceiling of the chamber in a rapid, practiced assessment. There, in the far left corner, where the chamber wall met the ceiling at an acute angle, a fracture line that had not been visible an hour ago. Or rather, a fracture line that had been there all along, dormant and stable, but was now showing fresh movement. A thin cascade of fine rock dust was sifting down from it, barely visible in the headlamp beam, like a slow, silent breath. The extreme cold outside was doing what extreme cold did to rock, contracting it, stressing it, forcing movement along existing fault lines. She had taught this process in her environmental hazards module. Thermal contraction, fracturing. At sustained temperatures below -25, even solid granite could experience stress fracturing along pre-existing weaknesses. The copper bell had stood for over a century, but it had never, in all likelihood, endured a night quite like this one. She needed to assess the stability of the chamber ceiling immediately, and she needed to do it with the tools she had, which were her headlamp, her geological knowledge, and her hands. She crossed to the fracture line and examined it closely, pressing her fingertips against the rock on either side of the crack, feeling for differential movement. The fracture ran approximately 3 feet along the ceiling junction and was perhaps 2 millimeters wide at its broadest point. She watched it for 60 seconds, counting her breaths to keep time. The rock dust had stopped falling. She pressed again. No movement under her fingers. The fracture had shifted and then stabilized, the rock finding a new equilibrium under the thermal stress. It was not, she assessed, an active progression. It was a completed adjustment. The ceiling was holding. But there was a secondary problem. The movement had disturbed the timber support framework at the chamber entrance. The old crossbeam she had noted earlier, already partially deteriorated, had shifted under the vibration. It now leaned at an angle that placed uneven load on the left side of the entrance frame, and she could see from the compression pattern in the wood that the left upright was close to its failure threshold. If that upright failed, the entrance frame would collapse inward. It wouldn't bring down the ceiling. The rock was self-supporting, but it would seal the tunnel connecting the chamber to the ventilation entrance. They would be trapped. She had perhaps minutes to address it. Dorothea looked around the chamber floor rapidly, cataloging available materials. Loose rocks of various sizes. Fragments of old timber from a collapsed support further back in the chamber. The camp hatchet in her backpack. Her own physical strength, which was, she noted with clinical honesty, somewhat diminished by cold and exhaustion, but still functional. She grabbed the hatchet and moved to the failing upright. The original timber was compromised beyond saving. She could see the grain separation that indicated the wood had been slowly failing for years, weakened by moisture and age, waiting for exactly this kind of additional stress to finish the job. Try to reinforce it directly would be futile. What she needed was to redistribute the load, to transfer the weight currently concentrated on the failing upright to the rock wall beside it, which was solid and immovable. She selected 3 rocks from the chamber floor, each roughly the size and shape of a brick, and began wedging them into the gap between the leaning timber crossbeam and the rock wall on its left side. The fit wasn't perfect. It never was in field conditions, but by alternating the rock sizes and packing smaller debris into the remaining gaps, she was able to create a compression fit that transferred the beam's weight laterally into the wall rather than downward onto the failing upright. It took 11 minutes. Her hands were shaking, partly from cold and partly from adrenaline, and she dropped 2 of the smaller rocks twice before getting them seated properly. Biscuit sat at the edge of the sleeping bag and watched her with focused attention, occasionally glancing at the entrance frame and back at her as though monitoring her progress. When she was finished, she stepped back and examined her work. The crossbeam was stable. The load was distributed. The entrance was clear. She returned to the sleeping bag, sat down heavily, and put her arms around Biscuit. He pressed his face against her neck, and she held him tightly and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite crying, but was adjacent to it. A release of tension that had been building since 9:15 that morning when Stephen Mercer had appeared at her door with his briefcase and his practiced, apologetic smile. Then she straightened up, wiped her face on her sleeve, and picked up Cordelia Ashworth's journal. If Cordelia had survived a winter in this mine with 19th century equipment and pure determination, Dorothea could survive one night. She owed it to both of them to find out what Cordelia had discovered. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest Dorothea had ever lived through. She dozed in short intervals, never fully surrendering to sleep, maintaining the same fractional awareness she had learned to sustain during long overnight monitoring shifts in active mines earlier in her career. Every 20 minutes or so, she surfaced fully, checked her extremities for sensation, confirmed Biscuit was breathing normally and warm against her side, and assessed the chamber for any new sounds or structural changes. Each time, everything was stable. Each time, she allowed herself to sink back toward the edge of sleep without crossing it entirely. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the world above. She could hear it, faintly, as a low and almost melodic roar transmitted through the rock. The sound of wind moving at speed across the hillside, driving snow against the frozen terrain, reshaping the landscape into something unrecognizable. Occasionally a deeper sound cut through it, the percussive crack of a tree failing under the combined stress of cold and ice load, followed by the muffled crash of its fall. Each time she heard one, she felt the same quiet gratitude for the granite walls surrounding her. In the intervals between dozing, she read Cordelia's journal by headlamp, rationing the battery carefully, reading 2 or 3 entries at a time, and then switching the lamp off and sitting in the total darkness of the mine with the journal closed on her lap, thinking about what she had read. Cordelia Ashworth's story assembled itself across the journal pages with a gradual clarity of a geological formation emerging from an excavation. She had come to Greystone in the autumn of 1893, hired by the Copperbell's Eastern investors as an independent surveyor specifically because her rates were lower than her male counterparts, a fact she noted in her journal with dry, unsentimental precision. She had been given a junior title, housed in the cheapest available accommodation, and systematically excluded from the formal reporting structure by the mine foreman, a man named Briggs who had immediately recognized her competence and responded to it with the particular anxiety of someone whose own mediocrity has just been illuminated by comparison. But Cordelia had continued working. She had surveyed every tunnel, every shaft, every accessible formation in the Copperbell with meticulous thoroughness, recording everything in duplicate. One copy for the official record that Briggs would appropriate. One copy kept in her satchel in the secondary chamber, where he never went because the ventilation tunnel entrance was too narrow for a man of his dimensions to comfortably navigate. The mineral discovery she had referenced in the January entry was documented in extraordinary detail across the final third of the journal. What Cordelia had found in the lower eastern tunnel was a formation of rare earth elements, specifically a concentrated deposit of what her 1890s terminology called heavy spar minerals, which Dorothea, reading with a century of additional geological knowledge, recognized immediately as a significant concentration of barium sulfate associated with rare earth element mineralization. In the 1890s, the significance of such a deposit would have been limited. The industrial applications of rare earth elements were largely unknown. But in the 21st century, those same elements were foundational to the production of electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, and virtually every category of modern electronics. Cordelia had found something that her era couldn't fully value. She had documented it with scientific precision, preserved the evidence in core samples, and hidden everything in a mine chamber where it had waited undisturbed for 128 years to be found by someone who understood what it meant. Dorothea was still sitting with that understanding settled heavily in her mind when the sound reached her. Faint at first, mechanical, an engine, more than one engine, somewhere above and to the north, muffled by rock and snow but unmistakably real. She was on her feet before the sound had fully registered consciously, her body responding to it before her mind caught up. Snowmobiles. She checked her watch. 7:42 a.m., full daylight above, or what passed for it in a blizzard. Someone was searching the hillside. She moved to the ventilation tunnel immediately, pulling away the rock barrier she had built the night before, working fast but carefully, keeping the structure intact enough to rebuild if needed. Biscuit was beside her, his energy suddenly transformed from the patient stillness of the night into sharp, focused alertness. He understood. She was certain of it. The engine's sounds grew closer, then seemed to plateau, moving along the hillside above and to the north, but not descending toward the mine entrance. They were following the ridgeline, she realized, the most logical search pattern for teams working from the road. They wouldn't necessarily think to check the lower face of the hill. They wouldn't know about the ventilation entrance. They could pass within 200 feet and never see it, especially with fresh snow having drifted against the opening overnight. She needed to be visible. She needed to be loud. She crawled through the ventilation tunnel and emerged into the outside world for the first time since the previous evening. The cold was a physical shock even after everything she had already endured, a wall of Arctic air that hit her simultaneously from every direction, finding the gaps that the mine's stillness had allowed her to forget existed. The blizzard had eased slightly from its overnight peak, but was still driving hard, visibility perhaps 40 feet in the gray morning light. Snow had drifted to her waist against the hillside, directly in front of the entrance. She stood up into it anyway. She pulled her emergency whistle from the chest pocket of her jacket and blew 3 long blasts, the standard distress signal, the sound cutting sharply through the wind. She blew it again, and again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. She alternated between the whistle and her headlamp, pointing the beam uphill toward where she could hear the engines, flashing the SOS pattern she had been trained to signal since her first field safety course in 1974. Biscuit crawled out of the tunnel behind her and began barking, a full-throated, carrying sound that cut through the wind with a clarity that her whistle couldn't match. She let him bark. His voice was carrying further than anything she had. The engine sounds changed direction, slowly at first. Then, with increasing decisiveness, they were moving toward her, descending the hillside, navigating between the trees, following the sound of a dog who had decided that this particular moment required everything he had. 2 minutes later, the first snowmobile appeared through the blowing snow, its headlights sweeping across the hillside in a wide arc before finding her. A woman standing waist-deep in a drift in front of mine entrance, waving her headlamp with one hand and holding the collar of a barking Australian shepherd with the other. The snowmobile stopped. The driver stood up. Even at 40 feet, through the blowing snow and the bulk of his rescue gear, she could see the shock in his posture, the involuntary stillness of someone who has prepared themselves to find a body and found a living person instead. He reached her in under a minute, pulling off his helmet, his expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, relief, and professional composure. "Ma'am, are you Dorothea Vance?" "I am," she said. Her voice was rough and dry from the cold and the long hours of silence, but it was steady. "And this is Biscuit. He's the one who found the mine, and he's the one who just flagged you down, so any credit for this rescue belongs primarily to him." The man stared at her for a moment. Then 2 more snowmobiles appeared through the trees behind him, and everything accelerated into the organized, purposeful activity of a rescue operation finding its footing. They wrapped her in an emergency blanket. They pressed a thermos of hot coffee into her hands, and she drank it so fast it burned. They checked her fingers and toes for frostbite, finding only the very earliest signs on 2 fingertips of her right hand, where a gap in her glove lining had allowed cold penetration, and pronounced both her and Biscuit in remarkable condition given the circumstances. The temperature last night hit -38. One of the rescuers told her quietly, "We didn't expect to find you alive." Dorothea thought about Cordelia Ashworth, sitting in that same chamber in the winter of 1893 with nothing but candlelight and determination and a leather satchel full of evidence that no one in her era was fully equipped to value. "I had help," she said, "from further back than you'd think." She reached into her jacket and confirmed that Cordelia's journal was still there, pressed against her chest where she had kept it through the night. Then she let them help her onto the rescue sled, tucked Biscuit against her side under the insulated blanket, and began the journey back toward the world that had tried to discard her. The town of Greystone had not expected Dorothea Vance to come back alive. That was the uncomfortable truth that hung over everything that followed her rescue. Unspoken but present in every conversation, every interaction, every carefully worded statement issued by the various parties who had contributed to putting a 71-year-old woman out of her home in the middle of a historic blizzard. The search party had been organized not with any particular urgency or optimism, but largely as a procedural necessity, a formality that needed to be completed before the official paperwork could describe what everyone involved had privately assumed was an inevitable outcome. Instead, she had emerged from a snowdrift in front of an abandoned mine with her dog, her backpack, and the calm, unhurried composure of someone who had simply gone somewhere difficult and come back, the way she had done her entire professional life. The hospital in Fort Collins, where the rescue team transported her by snowmobile and then by emergency vehicle, confirmed what the rescuers had already observed. Mild dehydration, early-stage frostbite on 2 fingertips that would resolve completely within days. Core body temperature slightly below normal, but recovering rapidly. Otherwise, the attending physician told her with poorly concealed astonishment, she was in better condition than most people half her age who came through his emergency department on a routine Tuesday. "You should not have survived that night," he said, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone still processing the medical improbability in front of him. "I had 38 years of field work and a very good dog," Dorothea replied, "and a mind that was better built than most of the decisions made by the people who put me in it." By the time she was discharged the following morning, The story had already escaped the hospital and spread through the regional news cycle with the unstoppable momentum of something that touches a nerve the public didn't know it had. Elderly geologist evicted in historic blizzard. Missing overnight at -38. Found alive in abandoned mine. The headlines were blunt and they were brutal in their accuracy, and the public reaction to them was immediate and unambiguous. The phone lines at Halcyon Ridge Development's Denver office were reportedly overwhelmed within hours. Their social media accounts became the site of a sustained and eloquent public dismantling. 3 state legislators issued statements calling for an investigation into the land acquisition practices that had enabled the eviction. The judge who had ruled against Dorothea found his campaign finance records the subject of considerable journalistic interest, and the resulting coverage was not favorable. Stephen Mercer did not issue a public statement. He did not need to. The statement issued by Halcyon Ridge on the 3rd day after a rescue said everything that needed to be said in the carefully constructed language of a corporation attempting to minimize legal exposure while appearing to act from conscience. The statement said, reevaluating the Greystone acquisition in light of new information regarding community impact. They were prepared to discuss a resolution with Mrs. Vance and her legal representatives at the earliest opportunity. They deeply regretted any hardship caused by the property transition process. Dorothea read the statement once and set it aside. She had more important things to attend to. The morning after her discharge from the hospital, still moving carefully to protect her healing fingertips, she contacted the Colorado School of Mines and asked to speak with the chair of the Department of Economic Geology. She described what she had found in the Copperbell mine. She described Cordelia Ashworth's journal, her survey map, and her core samples. She described the mineral formation Cordelia had documented in the lower eastern tunnel in January of 1894 and translated it into contemporary geological terminology with the precision of someone who had spent 4 decades thinking in exactly this language. The response from the other end of the line was a silence so complete and so extended that she initially thought the call had dropped. Then the department chair said, very quietly, "Can you bring me the journal?" What followed over the next 6 weeks was the kind of institutional mobilization that the academic world reserves for genuinely significant discoveries. A team of economic geologists from the Colorado School of Mines conducted a formal reassessment of the Copperbell mine, using Cordelia's survey map and core samples as their starting point. What they found in the lower eastern tunnel confirmed and exceeded Cordelia's 1894 documentation. The rare earth element deposit she had identified was not only real, but substantial. A significant concentration of neodymium, dysprosium, and associated elements with meaningful commercial and strategic value in the context of 21st century clean energy technology. The discovery triggered a cascade of consequences that moved faster than Dorothea had anticipated. The Copperbell mine and the surrounding hillside were immediately designated as a site of geological and historical significance, placing them under state protection and effectively ending Halcyon Ridge's development ambitions for the entire area. The legal challenge to Dorothea's property ownership was withdrawn without contest. Halcyon Ridge's attorneys, it appeared, had calculated that the reputational cost of continued litigation was no longer worth whatever the land had represented to them before the discovery changed its entire context. Dorothea moved back into her home on a Tuesday morning in late January, 6 weeks after she had walked out of it into a blizzard. She drove up the gravel driveway in her truck with Biscuit in the passenger seat and sat for a moment looking at the building that she and Franklin had constructed with their own hands 38 years ago. The wood stove was cold. The pipes had not frozen, which was either luck or the residual quality of Franklin's insulation work, and she chose to believe it was the latter. She went inside and started a fire. Cordelia Ashworth's contribution to the story did not remain a footnote. The historical documentation of a female mining surveyor operating professionally in Colorado in 1893 was, the historians who became involved in the subsequent months confirmed, genuinely unprecedented. Her journal, map, and core samples were donated by Dorothea to the Colorado School of Mines archive, where they became the centerpiece of a dedicated exhibition on women in the history of Western mining. Cordelia's name, absent from every official Copperbell record during her lifetime because Briggs had systematically removed it, was restored to the historical record with considerable ceremony. The Colorado Historical Society proposed naming the protected site the Cordelia Ashworth Heritage Mine. The Geological Department proposed calling it the Vance Ashworth Geological Preserve. After several months of discussion, the two organizations reached a compromise. It became the Cordelia Ashworth and Dorothea Vance Heritage Site, a protected area encompassing the mine, the surrounding hillside, and the lower slopes where the rare earth deposits sat undisturbed, studied but not extracted, its value lying not in what could be taken from it, but in what its existence and its history represented. On a warm afternoon in early May, Dorothea stood at the entrance to the Copperbell Mine's ventilation shaft, now fitted with a small bronze plaque bearing Cordelia Ashworth's name and dates, and felt the familiar cool mineral air drifting out from the darkness within. Biscuit sat beside her, one ear forward and one ear back, watching a ground squirrel with professional interest. She thought about Cordelia, sitting in the secondary chamber through the winter of 1893, recording her observations with careful precision, hiding her evidence from a man who wanted to own her work, hoping that someday someone would find it and understand its value. She thought about the hibernating bear, still somewhere in the depths of the mine, entirely indifferent to all of it. She thought about Franklin, who had always told her that the most interesting geological formations were the ones that had been under pressure for a very long time. He had not been wrong. That evening, Dorothea sat on the porch of her home at the edge of the protected hillside and watched the last light of a Colorado spring sunset move across the peaks to the west. The sky went through its familiar sequence, gold to amber to a deep, saturated rose that reflected off the snow still clinging to the higher elevations, and she sat through all of it without moving, Biscuit warm and solid against her leg, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. She had been asked, many times over the preceding months, what she thought about everything that had happened. Journalists had asked her. The historians working on the Cordelia Ashworth exhibition had asked her. The geology students who had toured the Copperbell site in April had asked her, a dozen of them standing in a semicircle in front of the ventilation entrance while she explained the thermal dynamics of mine shelter and the geological significance of what Cordelia had found. Everyone wanted to know what she made of it, what it meant, what she had learned. She had given different answers to different people, tailored to their contexts and their questions. But sitting alone on her porch in the last of the evening light, with no audience and no obligation to be concise or quotable, she let herself think through the full answer for the first time. The first thing she had learned, or rather, the first thing she had been reminded of, because she had always known it and had simply allowed the ordinary pressures of ordinary life to push it toward the back, was that knowledge is not passive. It does not sit quietly inside you and wait to be appreciated. It acts. It moves through the world in the form of decisions made under pressure, assessments completed in the dark, problems solved with whatever materials are at hand. Her 38 years of geological fieldwork had not been an abstract professional biography. They had been a survival toolkit assembled piece by piece over decades. And on the night of December 11th, they had deployed themselves with a completeness and a precision that still, months later, filled her with a kind of quiet awe. She had known how to read rock. She had known how to assess a mine's structural stability in the dark with her hands and a headlamp. She had known how to manage hypothermia, how to seal an entrance against wind infiltration, how to calculate the insulating properties of granite versus wood versus still air. She had known, because she had surveyed it 30 years earlier, that the Copperbell existed and where its ventilation entrance was located. None of that knowledge had been acquired in anticipation of that specific night. All of it had been useful anyway. That was the nature of genuine expertise. It didn't wait to be relevant. It simply was accumulated and ready, patient as geology itself. The second thing she had learned was about continuity, about the way that lives and knowledge and effort extend forward through time in ways that their originators can never fully anticipate or control. Cordelia Ashworth had sat in a mine chamber in the winter of 1893 and documented a mineral formation that her era lacked the technological context to fully value. She had hidden her evidence from a man who wanted to steal her work, trusting that the evidence itself would outlast both of them. She had been right. 128 years later, her core samples had formed the basis of a geological assessment that changed the future of an entire piece of Colorado landscape. Her name, systematically erased during her lifetime, was now on a bronze plaque at the entrance to the mine where she had worked. Her journal was in a climate-controlled archive at one of the premier geological institutions in the country. Cordelia had not known any of that would happen. She had simply done her work as well as she could, preserved the evidence as carefully as she could, and trusted the future with the rest. There was something in that, Dorothea thought, that went beyond professional dedication into something closer to faith. Not religious faith, but something equally sustaining. A belief that careful work done honestly would matter, even if the one who did it never lived to see how. She had tried to carry that same faith forward in the months since the rescue. The rare earth deposit in the lower eastern tunnel remained undisturbed under state protection, studied by geologists who published their findings openly and cited Cordelia Ashworth's 1894 documentation as the foundational reference. The exhibition at the Colorado School of Mines had drawn visitors from 12 states in its first month. 3 universities had contacted Dorothea about incorporating Cordelia's journal into their geological history curricula. The work was continuing. That was what mattered. The third thing, the thing she returned to most often, the one that sat closest to the center of everything, was simpler than the others and harder to articulate without it sounding like a platitude, which it was not. It was a lived truth, verified personally at -38 degrees in the dark. The world will sometimes tell you that you're finished. It will do this in the language of legal documents and court rulings and professional retirement, and the particular social dismissiveness reserved for people who have passed a certain age and are therefore presumed to have passed the point of meaningful contribution. It will tell you this with the confidence of institutions and the authority of official processes, and it will be wrong. Dorothea had been told she was finished. Her home had been taken. Her presence in the community had been deemed inconvenient. Her claim to her own land deemed legally indefensible. Her survival in a historic blizzard deemed statistically improbable. She had answered every one of those assessments in the same way, by applying 38 years of accumulated knowledge to the problem directly in front of her and solving it with the materials available. She had not been finished. She had been, as Franklin would have said, under pressure. And pressure, applied to the right materials over sufficient time, did not destroy. It transformed. The sun completed its descent behind the western peaks. The sky deepened through purple toward the first stars. Biscuit shifted against her leg, sighed with the profound satisfaction of a dog who has had an excellent day, and pressed his nose against her knee. She scratched behind his ears and thought about Cordelia Ashworth, alone in the mine chamber in 1893, writing by candlelight in her careful, precise hand, preserving what she knew for a future she would never see. She thought about the hibernating bear, somewhere in the dark of the lower shaft, metabolically patient, waiting for spring with a biological certainty that the world would warm again. She thought about the bronze plaque at the mine entrance, bearing 2 names now, a woman from the 19th century and a woman from the 21st, connected by a piece of granite hillside and a leather satchel and one terrible, clarifying night. For anyone who has ever been told they are too old, too slow, too far past their useful years to matter, remember Dorothea Vance. Remember that she walked 2 miles through a blizzard at 71 years old, using knowledge she had gathered across 4 decades of work. Remember that she stabilized a failing mine support in the dark with loose rocks and cold hands and a clear head. Remember that she found evidence the 19th century woman had hidden from the people trying to erase her and carried it back into the light where it could finally do what it had always been intended to do. Remember that the world tried to discard her, and she came back carrying something irreplaceable. Age is not a diminishment. It is an accumulation. Every year of genuine engagement with the world, every hour of work done carefully every problem solved with rigor, every piece of knowledge filed away in the specific drawers of specific expertise adds to something that does not diminish with time. It deepens. It becomes more itself. It becomes, under the right circumstances, exactly what is needed. Dorothea Vance, at 71 years old, accomplished what no one younger could have done in her place. Not because youth is incapable, but because the specific combination of knowledge, experience, and understanding that saved her life that night had taken 38 years to build. You cannot shortcut 38 years. You can only live them carefully and with full attention, and trust that they are building something worth having. Cordelia Ashworth trusted the future with her work. The future eventually proved worthy of that trust. Dorothea closed her eyes and listened to the Colorado night settle around her. The wind in the pines, the distant sound of a creek running fast with snow melt, Biscuit breathing steadily beside her. Her home, her hillside, her mind, in the way that places become yours not through legal documents, but through the work you do in them and the things you find there. She was not finished. She was at 71, precisely and exactly at the beginning of what came next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.